It all started with what I thought was the perfect love story, one that would rival even the greatest romances in books or movies. Nick wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my first real love, the kind of guy who made me believe in soulmates and happily ever afters. He had this way of making me feel like I was the center of his universe, showering me with sweet texts throughout the day, planning surprise dates, and always knowing exactly what to say when I needed comfort. But now, looking back, it's clear that every word he spoke, every touch, every smile was a calculated lie. A facade designed to keep me blind while he plotted behind my back, literally with someone I trusted more than anyone else, my older sister, Claire. The cracks began to show around Christmas, though at the time, I dismissed them as holiday stress or overthinking on my part. Nick seemed distant, distracted, constantly checking his phone under the table during family dinners. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off with excuses like work emails or just scrolling through social media. Meanwhile, Claire acted strange to avoiding eye contact, laughing nervously whenever Nick entered the room, and finding reasons to leave whenever we were together. My gut screamed that something was wrong, but I silenced it, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. After all, why would Nick betray me? And how could Claire, my role model, my confidant, ever hurt me? But fate has a cruel sense of humor. On December 27th, 2 days after Christmas, everything unraveled in the most devastating way possible. I went into Claire's room to borrow her hair straightener, a mundane task that turned into the defining moment of my life. The door creaked open slightly, and there they were, Nick and Claire, locked in an embrace so intimate it felt like a dagger piercing my chest. They weren't just kissing, they were lost in each other, completely oblivious to the world outside their twisted little bubble. For a split second, I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Was this real, or was I trapped in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from? Then, as if the scene itself wasn't enough to shatter me, Nick's phone lit up on Claire's bedside table. It buzzed incessantly, drawing my attention like a moth to a flame. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I picked it up. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. Dozens of messages between them, spanning months, detailing their plan to win me over and eventually push me out of the picture entirely. One message read, "She's starting to suspect something. We need to be careful." Another said, "Once she's gone, it'll just be us. Forever. Forever." The word echoed in my mind, mocking me, taunting me with its betrayal. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to demand answers, but no sound came out. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed, as Nick finally noticed me. His face went white, and Claire's followed suit. Their expressions shifted from shock to guilt to desperation in mere seconds, but none of it mattered. In that moment, I realized the depth of their deceit. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was premeditated, cold-blooded betrayal, and it came from the two people I loved most in the world. The betrayal I witnessed in Claire's room wasn't just a punch to the gut, it was an earthquake that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. But what came next was even worse, their reaction. My parents, who were supposed to be my safe haven, became the very people who drove the knife deeper into my already broken heart. It started with subtle pressure at first, comments here and there about how family comes first or how I should forgive and move on. At the time, I thought they were simply trying to smooth things over, maybe out of shock or discomfort. But it quickly escalated into something far more sinister. A few days after the incident, my mom sat me down in our living room while my dad hovered nearby like some silent enforcer. She didn't ask if I was okay, not once. Instead, she launched into this twisted lecture about forgiveness and loyalty, as though I had done something wrong by being hurt. "You need to think about what's best for everyone," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Claire made a mistake, but she's your sister. And Nick, well, he's young. People make mistakes. Mistakes." They weren't talking about forgetting to call someone back or spilling coffee on a shirt. They were excusing adultery and betrayal. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but before I could argue, she dropped the bombshell. "If you keep acting like this, we'll have no choice but to reconsider paying for your tuition." I stared at her, stunned. Tuition? Was she seriously using my education as leverage? College wasn't just some frivolous hobby for me, it was my future, my chance to build a life independent of them. Without their financial support, I'd be stuck working minimum wage jobs just to scrape by. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of their ultimatum. Either I swallowed my pride and pretended everything was fine, or I stood up for myself and risked losing everything I'd worked so hard for. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't asking me to forgive, they were forcing me to surrender. But the worst part, that came during dinner later that week. We were sitting around the table, the same table where Nick used to laugh and joke with us, where Claire would tease me about being too love-struck. Now, it felt like a war zone. The air was thick with tension, every bite tasting bitter in my mouth. When I tried to explain why I couldn't just get over it, my mom snapped. Her fork clattered against her plate as she turned to me, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're selfish," she spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "All you care about is yourself. Do you even realize how much pain you're causing this family? Claire is devastated, and Nick feels terrible. You're ruining everything." Her words hit me like a slap across the face. Selfish. I was selfish. After everything they'd done, after Claire and Nick had betrayed me behind my back, she had the nerve to call me the problem. I wanted to scream, to throw my glass of water at her, to demand how she could sit there and act like I was the villain. But I couldn't. My throat tightened, choking off any response I might have given. All I could do was sit there, frozen, as tears welled up in my eyes. My dad stayed silent, staring at his food like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Even Claire avoided looking at me, her guilt written all over her face. What hurt the most wasn't just the accusation, it was the realization that my mom truly believed what she was saying. In her mind, I was the one destroying the family, not Claire or Nick. To her, I was expendable, a loose thread that needed to be snipped for the sake of keeping appearances intact. It was maddening, infuriating, and utterly soul-crushing. Every word she said echoed in my head long after the meal ended, replaying over and over like a broken record. How could she not see how much they'd hurt me? How could she side with them so easily? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with anger and despair. I felt like I was drowning, pulled under by the weight of their expectations. For years, I'd idolized my mom, thinking she was this perfect, selfless woman who always put her family first. Now, I saw her for what she really was: controlling, manipulative, and completely blind to anything that didn't fit her narrow view of how things should be. I wanted to run away, to escape the suffocating grip of their judgment, but I didn't know where to go. My grandparents lived hours away, and Sam, the only person who truly understood, had her own life to deal with. I was alone, caught between the unbearable choice of losing myself or losing everything else. By morning, I still hadn't slept. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, hollow-eyed, like a ghost of the person I used to be. I wanted to fight back, to tell them exactly how I felt. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. They didn't care about me, they cared about control. And in that moment, I realized something even more painful: my family wasn't going to save me. If I wanted to survive, I'd have to save myself. The betrayal didn't just shatter my heart, it dismantled my entire existence. Every waking moment became a suffocating reminder of what I had lost, and every night turned into a battlefield within my own mind. Sleep, which used to be an escape, now felt like walking into a war zone. The nightmares were relentless, vivid, and cruel, replaying the same scene over and over again: Nick and Claire together, their laughter mocking me, their eyes filled with disdain as if daring me to stop them. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake up from these dreams until they decided it was time for me to face reality again. I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming so loudly that even my neighbors could hear. Sometimes, I'd cry myself back to sleep, only to be dragged into another nightmare moments later. It was a vicious cycle, one that left me physically and emotionally drained by morning. My body ached from tossing and turning, but the pain in my chest, the hollow void where trust and love once resided, was far worse. Each dream felt more real than the last, as though my subconscious was punishing me for not seeing the truth sooner. By day, the world around me seemed muted, like I was watching life through a foggy window. Colors appeared duller, sounds muffled, and conversations meaningless. I went through the motions, getting dressed, going to work, eating when necessary, but none of it mattered anymore. Everything felt empty, devoid of purpose. Even driving, something I'd done effortlessly for years, became dangerous. One afternoon, while heading home from the grocery store, I found myself zoning out at a red light. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying fragments of the betrayal like a broken record. Suddenly, a loud honk snapped me back to reality. The car behind me was inches away, its driver leaning on the horn with frustration. Startled, I slammed on the gas, narrowly avoiding a collision. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through my veins, but the relief was fleeting. That incident haunted me for days. What if I hadn't reacted quickly enough? What if someone else had been hurt because of my inability to focus? The thought terrified me. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about me spiraling into despair. My mental state was putting others in danger too. But the worst part came a week later. I was driving down a busy highway during rush hour, my mind clouded with thoughts of Nick and Claire's betrayal. Their faces kept flashing in my head, taunting me, whispering cruel words I couldn't silence. Before I knew it, tears blurred my vision, and I swerved slightly into the adjacent lane. Horns blared all around me, tires screeched, and cars swerved to avoid hitting mine. Panic set in as I struggled to regain control of the vehicle, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. Somehow, I managed to pull over onto the shoulder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sitting there, alone in my car, I broke down completely. My sobs echoed inside the small space, each one heavier than the last. How had it come to this? How had I let things get so bad that I was risking not only my life but also the lives of innocent people? The weight of my failures pressed down on me, suffocating and unrelenting. I called Sam immediately, barely able to choke out the words between sobs. She arrived within minutes, her face pale with worrying. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," she said firmly, wrapping her arms around me. "This isn't living, it's surviving, and barely at that." Her words hit me harder than any slap ever could. She was right. I wasn't living anymore, I was existing in a fragile shell of who I used to be. The betrayal had consumed me entirely, leaving nothing behind but anger, sadness, and fear. I hated feeling this way, hated being trapped in a prison of my own making, but I didn't know how to break free. Therapy sessions with my grandparents' recommended counselor helped, but progress was slow. Some days, I felt like I was clawing my way out of a dark pit, only to slip back down again. Other days, I convinced myself that maybe I deserved this pain, that somehow I had brought it upon myself. It wasn't until weeks later, after nearly causing another accident, that I finally admitted I needed help. Driving home late one evening, I found myself frozen at yet another intersection, unable to move forward or backward. Tears streamed down my face as I sat there, paralyzed by indecision and self-loathing. A stranger knocked on my window, asking if I was okay. Their concern startled me, forcing me to acknowledge just how far I had fallen. In that moment, I vowed to take back control, not for anyone else, but for myself. Because deep down, beneath all the pain and anger, I knew I deserved better than this. After the storm of betrayal and rejection from my own family, I felt like a shipwrecked survivor adrift in an endless ocean. My parents had not only sided with Claire and Nick but also tried to gaslight me into believing that I was the problem, that my feelings were dramatic and unwarranted. The weight of their betrayal crushed me, leaving me emotionally paralyzed. But just when I thought all hope was lost, two people stepped in to pull me back from the abyss: my grandparents and Sam. Sam wasn't just my best friend, she was my lifeline during those dark days. While I retreated into myself, drowning in despair, Sam refused to let anyone, including my so-called family, get away with what they'd done. One evening, as we sat together on her couch eating takeout pizza, she turned to me with fire in her eyes. "They can't treat you like this," she said firmly. You're better than them, and if no one else is going to stand up for you, then I will." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. She had already shared my letter online, exposing the truth about Claire and Nick's affair, which caused ripples throughout our small community. But it turned out that was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of notifications on my phone. Videos and photos flooded social media showing a group of people standing outside my parents' house holding signs that read, "Respect your daughter's feelings," and "Families should be supportive, not toxic." It was surreal. Sam had organized a mini protest right in front of their home, rallying friends, acquaintances, and even strangers who resonated with my story. Neighbors whispered behind closed curtains, some shaking their heads in disapproval at my parents' behavior, while others openly condemned them. For once, the tables were turned. My mom, who prided herself on being the perfect church-going woman, now faced public humiliation. People stopped inviting her to events, avoided sitting near her at gatherings, and even hurled insults when she dared to step foot outside. The shame was palpable. It hung over their household like a dark cloud. Meanwhile, my grandparents took action in a different way. They knew how much control my parents still held over my life, especially financially. Despite my age, my parents managed every aspect of my finances, including my tuition payments and bank accounts. Without their support, I wouldn't have been able to afford college or maintain any semblance of independence. Recognizing this vulnerability, my grandparents hired a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Harper, to help me gain full autonomy over my financial affairs. Ms. Harper wasted no time digging into the details. She uncovered years' worth of transactions where my parents had used my money for personal expenses without my knowledge. When confronted, my dad tried to brush it off as family business, but there was no denying the evidence. Armed with legal documents and ironclad arguments, Ms. Harper filed paperwork to transfer ownership of my accounts directly to me. My parents fought back, claiming I was too immature to handle such responsibilities, but their protests fell flat under scrutiny. Their hypocrisy was glaringly obvious. They cared more about maintaining control than fostering my growth. During one particularly tense meeting, my mom stormed into the room, red-faced and furious. "How dare you go behind our backs?" she shouted, pointing a finger at me. Her voice trembled with rage, but beneath it lay a layer of fear of losing the power she'd clung to for so long. My grandfather stood beside me, his posture tall and unyielding. "Enough," he said calmly but firmly. "You've done enough damage. Let her live her life." His words silenced her instantly, though the tension lingered like static electricity in the air. With each passing day, I began to feel a shift, not just in my circumstances but within myself. Knowing that Sam and my grandparents were fighting for me gave me strength I hadn't realized I possessed. For the first time since everything unraveled, I started imagining a future where I didn't need my parents' approval or their money to survive. I envisioned a life built on my terms, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being rather than using me as a pawn in their twisted games. By the time the dust settled, my world looked vastly different. My parents' reputation lay in tatters, and I finally had access to resources that allowed me to pursue my dreams independently. Yet, the victory wasn't just material, it was deeply personal. With Sam cheering me on and my grandparents guiding me, I found solace in knowing that true family isn't defined by blood but by love, loyalty, and sacrifice. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt free. The fallout from Sam's viral post didn't just ripple through my family, it exploded like a bomb, leaving devastation in its wake. My mom, who had always prided herself on being the epitome of grace and morality within our tight-knit community, found her world crumbling faster than she could defend it. The church where she'd spent decades building her reputation as a perfect Christian woman turned against her almost overnight. At first, she tried to explain herself during Sunday services, pleading with congregants that what happened wasn't as bad as it seemed, but no one listened. Instead, whispers filled the pews, accusing glances followed her every move, and soon enough, the pastor himself called for an emergency meeting. "We cannot condone betrayal and hypocrisy," he declared sternly, his voice echoing through the chapel. By the end of the week, my mom was officially excommunicated, a public shaming so severe that even outsiders began talking about it. Her attempts to justify her actions only made things worse. One evening, after posting a lengthy defense on social media, someone threw eggs at our front window. The sound woke me up, but I stayed silent, watching from my grandparents' house via security cameras they'd installed for safety. My mom stood frozen in shock, clutching her robe tightly around her body, tears streaming down her face. For once, she looked fragile, like the facade she'd built over years was cracking under the weight of her own choices. But if my mom bore the brunt of communal outrage, Claire faced something far more personal and brutal. Her life unraveled piece by piece, starting with her job. Within days of Sam's post going viral, her boss called her into his office. "This kind of scandal doesn't reflect well on the company," he said coldly before handing her a termination letter. Claire begged him to reconsider, insisting she'd done nothing illegal or unethical, but he wouldn't budge. As she packed up her desk, coworkers avoided eye contact, some muttering under their breath about how disgusted they were. Word spread quickly, and soon, finding another job became nearly impossible. Every interview ended the same way, polite smiles fading into awkward silences when her name popped up in background checks. Things escalated further whenever Claire dared to step outside. Grocery shopping turned into a gauntlet of judgmental stares and muttered insults. People would stop mid-aisle to glare at her, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. Once, while picking out cereal, a stranger approached her, sneering, "How does it feel to ruin your sister's life?" Before Claire could respond, the woman slapped her hard across the cheek, leaving a red mark that lingered for hours. Claire stumbled back, clutching her face, too stunned to react. Other shoppers gathered around, some clucking disapprovingly at the aggressor, others nodding in agreement. It was chaos, a scene straight out of a nightmare, and Claire fled the store in tears, vowing never to return. Even online, there was no escape. Anonymous trolls flooded her social media accounts with hateful messages, calling her everything from a home wrecker to a monster. She deleted all her profiles, hoping to disappear, but real-life encounters proved harder to avoid. Neighbors stopped greeting her, old friends blocked her number. Even extended family members distanced themselves, refusing invitations to gatherings where Claire might show up. Isolation consumed her, turning her once confident demeanor into a shell of paranoia and despair. Meanwhile, my dad struggled silently, caught between loyalty to my mom and growing disillusionment with her decisions. He lost friends rapidly. Men he'd known since childhood now refused to meet his gaze at local bars or golf courses. Their wives banned him from neighborhood barbecues, citing family values as their reason. At work, colleagues whispered behind his back, questioning how a man could side with such betrayal. His usual jovial demeanor faded, replaced by a stoic silence that spoke volumes about the guilt and shame eating away at him. Watching this unfold from afar, I felt conflicted. Part of me reveled in their suffering. It was poetic justice, wasn't it? They'd chosen Claire over me, dismissed my pain as drama, and now the entire community saw them for who they truly were. Yet another part of me couldn't ignore the lingering ache of loss. These were people I'd loved unconditionally, people I'd trusted above all else. Seeing them fall apart was both satisfying and heartbreaking, a reminder of how deeply intertwined we still were despite everything. One night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through news articles and forum threads discussing my family's downfall. Comments ranged from supportive, "Finally, someone stood up to toxic behavior," to "Cruel, they deserve everything coming to them." Amidst the noise, one comment struck me: "Betrayal leaves scars, but forgiveness can heal wounds." I stared at those words for a long time, wondering if healing was possible or even worth pursuing. For now, though, I chose to focus on rebuilding myself, letting the ruins of their lives serve as a backdrop to my journey toward freedom. Recovery wasn't a straight path. It was more like climbing out of a deep, jagged pit while constantly slipping back down. Therapy became my lifeline, but it wasn't easy. Every session felt like peeling off layers of scabs that had formed over years of hurt and betrayal. My therapist, Dr. Bennett, was patient yet firm, guiding me through the tangled web of emotions I'd buried inside. It was during one particularly grueling session that she diagnosed me with severe anxiety disorder, a condition triggered by the trauma of everything I'd endured. Hearing those words hit me hard. Anxiety. I thought I was just broken, not clinically struggling. But as Dr. Bennett explained how my body and mind had been fighting against each other since the betrayal, pieces began to fall into place. The sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the constant feeling of being on edge, it all made sense now. For months, I underwent intensive treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) sessions were exhausting, forcing me to confront memories I'd tried so desperately to suppress. Exposure therapy pushed me even further, making me visualize scenarios involving Nick and Claire until I could breathe through the pain without crumbling. Slowly, I started learning coping mechanisms, breathing techniques, grounding exercises, journaling, but progress was painfully slow. Some days, I felt like I was moving forward. Others, I wondered if I'd ever truly heal. Still, I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim some semblance of normalcy. One crisp autumn afternoon, my grandparents suggested we take a walk downtown. They knew I needed fresh air, something to distract me from the relentless cycle of therapy and self-reflection. At first, I resisted. I hated leaving the safety of their home, but eventually, I agreed. The streets buzzed with life, families strolling together, couples holding hands, children laughing. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel almost normal. Then, out of nowhere, I saw them. Across the street, sitting at an outdoor cafe table, were Nick and Claire. My heart stopped. Time seemed to freeze as my eyes locked onto theirs. They weren't just sitting there, they were laughing, leaning into each other like nothing had ever happened. Like they hadn't shattered my world. A wave of nausea crashed over me, followed by a suffocating tightness in my chest. My vision blurred, and before I could process what was happening, I collapsed onto the sidewalk. The next thing I remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, my grandparents hovering anxiously beside me. Apparently, I'd gone into a full-blown panic attack right there on the street. Strangers had called an ambulance, and paramedics rushed me to the As I lay there, hooked up to monitors beeping steadily, shame washed over me. How could I let them still have this kind of power over me? After everything I'd worked for, after all the therapy sessions and breakthroughs, seeing them had reduced me to this fragile state. But amidst the humiliation, something shifted within me. That night, lying awake in the dim glow of the hospital room, I realized I couldn't keep living like this, half alive, half afraid. If I wanted to truly move on, I had to sever every last tie binding me to my past. No more lingering doubts or second-guessing. No more allowing their actions to dictate my existence. This incident wasn't just another setback, it was a wake-up call. When I returned home, I threw myself into rebuilding my life with renewed determination. I redecorated my room, filling it with bright colors and motivational quotes. I started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others who were struggling. Each small step forward felt monumental, like chipping away at the walls I'd built around myself. And though the memory of that day lingered, haunting me in quiet moments, I refused to let it define me anymore. By the time winter rolled around, I noticed subtle changes. I laughed more freely, slept more soundly, and found joy in things I used to love. My grandparents noticed too, often remarking how proud they were of how far I'd come. Though scars remained both visible and invisible, I finally felt like I was emerging from the shadow of my past. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, I believed I could face it head-on. It had been over a year since I last saw Claire, and honestly, I hadn't planned on ever seeing her again. Life was finally starting to feel like it belonged to me, free from the suffocating grip of my family's betrayal, but fate has a cruel sense of humor. One ordinary afternoon, while picking up groceries at the local supermarket, I turned a corner into the produce aisle and froze. There she was, Claire. She looked different. Her once radiant confidence was replaced by something fragile, almost broken. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there, staring as if time itself had stopped. "Hey," she finally said, her voice trembling. Before I could react, She rushed toward me, her eyes welling with tears. "I need to talk to you. Please, just hear me out." I wanted to walk away, to leave her standing there like she'd left me all those months ago, but something in her desperation rooted me to the spot. She began speaking in a frantic rush, words spilling out faster than I could process them. "I'm so sorry for everything, and see, you have no idea how much I regret what I did. I ruined your life, and now mine is falling apart too." Her confession caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" I asked coldly, though curiosity tugged at the edges of my anger. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She was pregnant with Nick's baby. And not only that, but Nick had abandoned her the moment he found out. "He won't answer my calls or texts," she sobbed, clutching her stomach protectively. "He says he can't deal with this, that it's too much pressure. I don't know what to do, please, and see, I need help." For a split second, pity flickered inside me. Seeing her so vulnerable, so utterly defeated, stirred something primal, a sisterly instinct I thought I'd buried long ago. But then the reality of who she was slammed back into focus. This was the same person who had stolen my boyfriend, shattered my trust, and left me drowning in despair. How dare she come to me for help after everything? My fists clenched at my sides as conflicting emotions warred within me. Should I offer compassion, or should I let her suffer the consequences of her actions? Before I could decide, she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "You're the only one I have left," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Everyone else hates me, and I don't blame them, but you're stronger than all of us. If anyone can forgive me, it's you." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Was she serious? Did she really think I owed her anything after what she'd done? I pulled my arm free, taking a step back. "I don't hate you," I said firmly, meeting her tear-filled gaze. "But I also don't want you in my life. What happened between us isn't something I can just forget." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her crying in the middle of the grocery store. As I pushed my cart toward the checkout, guilt gnawed at me, but I reminded myself that her pain didn't erase mine. She had made her bed, now she had to lie in it. But the drama wasn't over yet. A week later, and a no number flashed across my phone screen late one night. Against my better judgment, I answered. On the other end was Nick, the man whose name still sent shivers down my spine. His voice was shaky, hesitant, as though he were bracing himself for rejection. "And see, I know I don't deserve to speak to you, but there's something you need to know," he blurted out before I could hang up. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him the next day at a quiet coffee shop. When I arrived, Nick looked like a shadow of his former self. Dark circles hung beneath his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled as he fidgeted with a napkin. After an awkward silence, he finally spoke. "Your mom. She orchestrated everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. According to him, my mother hadn't just passively approved of their affair, she'd actively encouraged it. Through direct messages, she'd convinced him that I was too clingy, too insecure, and that Claire would be a better match for him. At first, I resisted, he explained, but she kept pushing, saying it was for the best. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I swear, I didn't realize how far she'd go. The revelation felt like a knife twisting in my chest. All this time, I'd blamed Claire and Nick entirely, never imagining that my own mother, the woman who was supposed to protect me, had been the mastermind behind it all. My mind raced as fragments of memories clicked into place. Her dismissive comments about Nick and me, her constant praise for Claire, her refusal to take my side during the fallout. It all made sense now, and it was devastating. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as waves of betrayal crashed over me. Sleep eluded me for days as I replayed every interaction with my mother, searching for signs I'd missed. The weight of her manipulation crushed me, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about my family. If she could orchestrate such a betrayal, what else was she capable of? The confrontation with my mother wasn't just another argument, it was the culmination of years of betrayal, manipulation, and lies. After discovering that she had orchestrated Nick and Claire's affair behind my back, I couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of her betrayal crushed me, but it also ignited a fire inside me, a burning need for answers. So, early one morning, I drove to my parents' house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. My heart pounded in my chest as if it were trying to escape. I didn't know what I would say or how I would react, but I knew I couldn't let this go. When I arrived, I didn't bother knocking. I still had a key from when I lived there. Pushing open the door felt surreal, like stepping into enemy territory. My parents were in the kitchen, casually making breakfast as though nothing had ever happened. They froze when they saw me. My mom's face paled instantly, while my dad looked confused, almost guilty. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence hung heavy between us, suffocating and electric. Then, without preamble, I blurted out the question that had been eating away at me. Did you know about Claire and Nick? Did you set them up? My mom hesitated, her lips trembling slightly before she forced a weak smile. Why does that matter now? She asked dismissively, attempting to brush off the gravity of the situation. Her nonchalance sent a surge of rage coursing through me. How could she act like this was some trivial detail? Before I could stop myself, I slammed my hand down on the table, causing the dishes to rattle. Why does it matter? Are you serious right now? You ruined my life. You stood by and watched me fall apart while you did nothing. You encouraged Claire and Nick to hurt me because you thought it was for the best. Her expression shifted from defensive to indignant. You're overreacting, she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. Nick wasn't happy with you. He needed someone better suited for him, and Claire, she stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late that she'd said far more than she intended. Her words hit me like a freight train. Not only had she known about their affair, but she actively believed I wasn't worthy of love. I cut her off before she could continue. So what? You decided to play matchmaker with my boyfriend and my sister. You thought it was okay to destroy my relationship because you didn't approve of it. My voice cracked under the strain of emotion, tears streaming down my face. I grabbed a glass from the table and hurled it against the wall, shattering it into pieces. The sound echoed through the room, startling everyone including me. It was as if all the pain, anger, and frustration I'd bottled up for years exploded in that single moment. That's when my dad stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. What is she talking about? He demanded, looking between my mom and me. His voice carried an edge of panic, as though he sensed the ground beneath him was about to give way. My mom tried to explain, stumbling over her words. It's not like that, she insisted. I was only trying to protect our family. Clara and Nick, they were better together. You weren't seeing clearly. Her tone was eerily calm, as if she genuinely believed she'd done nothing wrong. But my dad wasn't buying it. His eyes widened in disbelief as the truth sank in. You went behind my back, he asked, his voice rising. You manipulated everything and you never told me. He turned to me, his gaze softening. Is this true? Did she really do this? Yes, I whispered, barely able to choke out the word. She planned it all. She made me think I was crazy for feeling hurt, like I was the problem. But none of this was my fault. The room erupted into chaos. My mom started yelling, defending herself with wild accusations. You were forcing Nick into something he didn't want, she shouted, pointing a finger at me. If you hadn't been so clingy, none of this would have happened. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. How dare she twist the narrative to make me the villain? Before I could respond, my dad exploded. Enough. He roared, slamming his fist on the table. The force of it knocked over a vase, sending water spilling across the floor. How could you betray your own daughter like this? How could you lie to us for so long? He turned to my mom, his face red with fury. I can't believe you. I can't trust you anymore. Then, in a voice filled with finality, he added, we're done. I'm filing for divorce. His declaration stunned everyone into silence. Even my mom seemed momentarily speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But then her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her chest. At first, I thought she was faking it, a dramatic attempt to regain control, but when she didn't move, panic set in. My dad rushed to her side, shaking her gently. "Call an ambulance," he yelled, his voice laced with urgency. As paramedics arrived and wheeled her away, I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unfold like it was happening to someone else. The house that once symbolized safety and warmth now felt alien, toxic. I realized then that I couldn't stay, not here, not with them. Turning on my heel, I walked out, leaving behind the shattered remains of my family. Years after the storm of betrayal and heartbreak had passed, I found myself sitting at a small desk in my new home, a cozy little house I'd bought with the earnings from an unexpected source, my book. Writing it wasn't something I'd planned. It came to me during one sleepless night when memories of Nick, Claire, and my mother's manipulation flooded back like a tidal wave. For so long, I'd carried the weight of their actions on my shoulders, silently nursing wounds that refused to fully heal. But that night, as tears streamed down my face, I realized I couldn't keep this story buried inside me any longer. It needed to be told, not just for me, but for others who might feel lost, broken, or betrayed by those they loved most. The process of writing was excruciating. Each word felt like reopening old scars, forcing me to relive every painful moment: the shock of walking in on Nick and Claire, the suffocating gaslighting from my parents, the isolation that followed. Yet, amidst the pain, there was clarity. I began to see how far I'd come from being that shattered 19-year-old girl drowning in despair to becoming a woman who had reclaimed her life piece by piece. The manuscript poured out of me over months, raw and unfiltered, capturing not only the darkness but also the glimmers of hope that eventually guided me toward healing. When it was finally published under the title Shattered Trust, I never imagined it would resonate with so many people. Within weeks, it climbed the bestseller lists, earning praise for its honesty and vulnerability. Readers reached out, sharing their own stories of betrayal, family dysfunction, and resilience. Their messages reminded me why I'd written the book in the first place, to remind others that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. With the financial success of the book, I achieved something I'd always dreamed of: a place I could truly call my own. My grandparents helped me pick out the perfect house, a modest yet charming cottage nestled near a quiet lake. Every corner of it symbolized freedom, freedom from the toxic ties that once bound me, freedom to build a future on my terms. Still, despite the joy of independence, life hadn't spared me entirely. Just months before the book's release, my father passed away suddenly from a severe heart attack. His death hit me harder than I expected. Though our relationship had been strained since the fallout, he was still the one person in my family who had stood up for me during the darkest days. He'd chosen to side with me against my mother, filing for divorce and cutting ties with Claire. In his final years, he tried to make amends, sending letters and voicemails apologizing for not protecting me sooner. I never replied, too hurt to forgive him completely, but deep down, I knew he loved me in his flawed way. One crisp autumn morning, I visited his gravesite for the first time since his passing. Clutching a bouquet of white lily, his favorite flowers, I stood before the headstone etched with his name, feeling a mix of grief and gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. For everything. Tears blurred my vision as memories of him surfaced: the way he'd hugged me tightly after I left the hospital, the look of guilt in his eyes when he learned the truth about Mom, and the quiet pride he showed when I graduated college. Despite his flaws, he had been the only anchor in a sea of chaos. Standing there, surrounded by the rustling leaves and cool breeze, I allowed myself to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger no longer served me. In that moment, I understood what true forgiveness meant. It wasn't about excusing the harm done or pretending the past didn't exist. It was about releasing the grip those memories had on me, choosing to move forward without letting bitterness define me. As I placed the flowers gently on his grave, I felt lighter, as if a heavy chain I'd unknowingly carried for years had finally fallen away. Turning to leave, I took one last glance at the inscription on his tombstone: "A loving father who did his best." Imperfect though he may have been, those words rang true, and for the first time, I believed them. Walking back to my car, I realized how much I'd grown. Life had tested me in ways I never imagined, but through the pain, I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't the same girl who once crumbled under betrayal. I was someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The journey wasn't easy, but it taught me invaluable lessons: that family isn't defined by blood but by love and loyalty, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that even in the deepest darkness, light can find its way through cracks. As I drove home, the sun breaking through the clouds, I smiled softly. For the first time in years, I felt whole and ready to embrace whatever lay ahead.